Hello again guys and welcome again to the channel. So today's video we're just going to take on a little bit of discussion on the current metagame of Standard. We know that still EZ Cauldron would be the main culprit here, but it is regularly checked by the Mono Red Aggro deck. So my resource website here would be the MTG Goldfish, wherein you can just check on the decks metagame standard, and you can see here the distribution of the type of decks and its meta percentage depending on recent results, MTG Online, on arena events, and on local, and even on major physical events for Magic the Gathering. So you can just browse through here, but today's video we're just going to kind of wrap up the common sideboards for each of these decks and what cards do they usually do. And for my resource here would be this website, which is the MTG Top 8, and you can check on the standard category here and check the results for the last 2 weeks, and make sure that the sideboard part is highlighted for these cards, also including the lands. But let's check on the decks that uses this, since we know that blue red and basically mono red are the main core themes that are being popular, and of course we expect that those sideboarded cards would also be aligned to those colors. So we go first with the Obliterating Bolt. So this is a 2-mana cost sorcery. It can deal 4 damage to a creature or planeswalker, and then it could exile it instead of going into the graveyard. And average, it's basically used at about 2.4 or about 2 to 3 copies in the sideboard, with almost half of the metagame decks are using. So you can just check in here, blue-red, this is mono-red, and also some of the control decks that's also having red and Boros Aggro particularly uses this card as one of their sideboard choices. And particularly this is a good answer to most of the aggro creatures, and can also define to exile them, meaning that any of the recursion effects and the reanimation effects would be disregarded. For the next card that is being popular here is the reprinted Annul, which is now in the EOE set. So this is an instant 1 cost to counter target artifact or enchantment spell. Basically it counters of the relevant spells here, such as that of the Cauldron. It can also counter Fear of Missing Out, and also for some of the self-bound creatures, for instance the enchantments that they use, such as Nowhere to Run, you can basically counter them with this spell. So this will be also relevant with at least 1.9 average, meaning at least 2 copies in the sideboard for 41.4% of the decks in the metagame. Next up is a Braid. This is reprinted also several times. It is a 2-mana cost instant that can deal 3 damage to creature or destroy artifact, and also goes well to answer the EZ Cauldron or any of the shenanigan artifacts. And basically most of the creatures in the metagame are that of a 3 toughness, so it can also be relevant in having a spot removal. So it is used in 31.6% of the decks, at average of at least 2 copies in the sideboard. For me personally, I have before tested this one, and I think some of the deck builds are having at least a main deck of this card in their build. And also in similar fashion we have Spell Pierce. This could also see some main deck effects in particularly the Dimir decks and even Azorius Control. So this card basically can counter a creature spell as control phase 2 at 1 mana, and if any time that your opponents would cast a turn 2 Cauldron, you're going to have a 1 mana cost Spell Pierce to counter it. So it's also relevant at least 1.6 average for 30% of the decks. Next is another spell, which is an instant spell, Fire Magic, from MTG Final Fantasy set. This can be relevant to sweep off any mana cost or 1 toughness cost creatures. For 1 mana, you can sweep 1 damage to each, and later on, you can pay 2 more to deal 2 damage to each creature. So, in relevance, this can become a sideboard of the ESET decks against the tokens. Can also be relevant against the self-bound, since most of the creatures here are 1 mana or 1 toughness or 2 toughness, and also the special token effects can be countered or dealt with by this spell. So at least 1 copy or 2 copies in the sideboard, 30% of the decks in the metagame. Next up, Negate. This is also a solid spot, solid counter spell, because for matchups against control and other mid-range decks that uses spot removals or mass removals, you can basically have a 2 mana cost solid counter. So that is at least 1 copy in average of 1.3 and 29.8% of the decks in the metagame are using this card. And next up, Tisha's Tidebinder is a similar or familiar creature sideboard, and also in the main deck of the Dimir mid-range decks. This can counter activated or triggered ability, and those ability if an artifact, creature, or planeswalker that permanent loses all abilities. So basically, it as long as there is creature is still in the battlefield, those artifact, creature, or planeswalker will basically be a vanilla and not only doing anything else once their activated or triggered ability is being countered. So popular against the mirror decks, so average 1.6 and 29.8% of the decks. And another sideboard here is Unable to Scream. So Decimal Scream disables creatures and just having them 0-2 base toughness in addition. So this is popular with the Simic decks, particularly the Simic midrange or the mirror, or even the decks with the 3 colors with having blue as their sideboard. This can disable relevant creatures such as that of the Screaming Nemesis, and averagely at least 2 copies in the sideboard of those decks, 27% of the metagame. And next is Dismal Stroke, another solid counter spell that counters any spell with mana value 4 or greater. This can be relevant, of course, if you are Dimir midrange and you're facing the metagame of heavy Azorius or Jeskai control decks, or even for color control. You can have this as your solid sideboard against them. So average 1, or maybe even some of them are having 2 copies in the deck with the post sideboard games, and it's 34.7% average for metagame decks. And we have Torch the Tower, very familiar for the EZ Cauldron deck. You can sacrifice bargain for additional 3 damage, and you can scry 1. You can also deal with the cards such as the Enduring Curiosity, wherein those shenanigans of graveyards, it would be exiled instead at instant speed. So this is average of 1.5 in the sideboard, but particularly in a generic metagame call, you would at least have 2 to 3 copies of this in their sideboard list. So 24.0% of the decks are using this card. And we are just going to wrap up with the 2 more cards. Duress would be your next sorcery card. This goes with the metagame of having mid-range against control matchups, and particularly also self-bounds can use this card to discard their mass removal or any of the relevant spot removal against the matchups. So at least 2 in the sideboard. For me, I use this one in my Golgari midrange decks. Particularly now, it's not in the metagame, but I have 3 copies of this in the sideboard against the control matchups, and only 23.3% of the decks are using this card. And lastly, before we wrap up this, you can have Sunspine Links. This is Mono Red's answer against the control decks, because they can punish them for having this number of basic lands they control, and it will deal damage, and those damage can be prevented and they can't gain life. So it's also a 5 for a body, which can attack for relevant damage if needed. So that is your wrap up of this cards. Again, MTG Top 8 standard, and you can check this list, particularly all of them, if you want to check again in the coming weeks, or if you're preparing for a major event. This can still be relevant, and you can just change this accordingly depending on the results submitted to this website. And again, your main resource maybe for deck builds would be your MTG Goldfish standard metagame listing, as you can see here as your references for your sideboard options and even for the main deck options. So that's particularly it. This would be your second week metagame sideboarding clue for the standard metagame, and we can still have one more of this in the future if we can do another video if we observe relevant changes. But I think so far Spider-Man set has not really made any significant in the sideboarding, but I saw some interesting deck builds that are revolving in one or two particular Spider-Man card. So again guys, this would be just your sideboard guide for the standard metagame as of this posting. Don't forget to subscribe. We can still have more of this in the future. Notifications on, and see you on the next video upload.